throughout the world. And there were some events that occurred, and I would like to explain why I became a syndicated columnist and the burdens of being a syndicated columnist. A few minutes ago, I was sort of complaining about having deadlines, hanging a book deadline. But when I accepted an invitation from Creators Syndicate, I also accepted to have a deadline every week. So every Friday, 7 p.m., I had to click the send button of a 750-word column, which is quite a bit of work, thinking that you have to do, first of all, the deadline, and then clean it up and clean it up and clean it up. And then what ended up happening was I decided, that was not the intention originally, to start putting the columns together into a book. And then months later, not only did I have to work with these weekly deadlines, but I also had a book deadline, and that became a little bit too much to handle, actually. So some of the motivations had to do with confluence of dramatic worldwide events. And I'll read from the introduction. I recognize that the United States and the world were entering a distinct period when the COVID-19 epidemic became a pandemic. In March of that year, I gave one column the rhetorical title, Pivotal Moment: What History Tells Us About COVID-19's Future Impact. So right there, I'm beginning to sort of cross the border of what a historian is supposed to do. Then came the killing of George Floyd, followed by mass demonstrations and social unrest in the United States and abroad. Sometimes we forget that Black Lives Matter had global reverberations and demonstrations in Paris, London, many other places. Then that was also an election year in the United States, the most conflictive and rancorous ever. Then came, if you want to bleep this, you may do so. Then came the big lie and January 6, 2021, and Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. Now, there are other things that are at play, global warming, but just these four developments with global ramifications reminded me that we were looking at a different period, that this is a break from the past. So what comes first, the columns or the book? Well, the obvious answer is the columns, but it is a little bit more complicated because I didn't want to just publish a collection of columns in chronological order. That didn't make a lot of sense. I believe that I had to curate, to use a sometimes overused term, to curate the collection, and in order to present them in a coherent way for the reader, I decided to break it into 9 chapters. I'll briefly go over them. American history, past, present, future. This had to do with my recognition that beginning in 2008, and particularly over the last 5 years, there were so many parallels between the U.S. antebellum and Civil War and what was happening in the United States. I'm a cultural historian, so I wrote a section entitled Culture is the History That We Inherit. 4, I never left the classroom, and these are several essays on education, books, and reading. Then there's one, Despierta Latino, Wake Up Latino. There's one on Puerto Rico, there's one on Cuba. And then towards the end, I want to wrap it up with a broad global perspective. And the title of that last chapter is Not Boring at All, Globalization and World Affairs. And that's an allusion to Francis Fukuyama, who back in 1980, 1989, wrote a book, The End of History, and he said, what's going to come after this is a very boring era, nothing close to that. So my book is also an apology for history. I believe that history is such an important discipline, and I'll read a brief quote on that subject. Readers will recognize that this book is an apology for the field of history that underscores its usefulness, its urgency, rather, in the grossly utilitarian context of the early 21st century. History matters for itself. It matters as a means for a better understanding of the present. It even matters when trying to anticipate future developments. That said, this book levels serious criticisms against the history profession and some of its practitioners' deviation from truth, well-supported arguments, and even common sense. Let me read some of the excerpts. I want to have plenty of time for questions and answers. And this is an example of how I was chronicling events as they were unfolding. This is one on the killing of George Floyd. And I wrote, I sit down to write in the wee hours of May 29, 2020. The city of Minneapolis is ablaze. Pandemonium broke out 4 or 5 hours ago as thousands of angry, mourning protesters surrounded the headquarters of the police 3rd Precinct. Protesters, some of whom engaged in vandalism and arson, demanding justice for George Floyd, the 46-year-old black man who was summarily murdered on Monday by Minneapolis policeman Derek Chauvin with the assistance of 4 other police officers. I can't breathe. Equally horrific were Floyd's final words. With an increasingly guttural voice, he pleads repeatedly with his tormentor. My neck hurts. Everything hurts. Water or something, please. I can't breathe. The agonizing man continues to demonstrate respect for his tormentors. Please, please. Not one curse or angry word comes out of his lips, which are taking on a whitish hue of death. He calls his deceased mother as if knowing that he will soon meet her or has already met her on the other side. He goes silent, the video capturing the quiet, motionless moment of his passing. I have 3 columns on January 4, 5, and 6 of 2021. I won't go into them, but this is how they start. The one on January 4. Notepad and pen in my right hand, TV remote control on the other, caffeine doses taken as needed. This will be a news-heavy week, and certainly it was. One of the things that I love doing in all of my writing is to draw from my experiences. I tell my students who want to be writers, well, give me some pointers, professor. And I tell them, well, live a rich life. And that means out of TikTok, because these experiences you can draw from. So the title of this one is 1989, History's Stubborn Twists and the Commencement Speaker who warned us to remain vigilant. None other than Tom Brokaw gave our commencement speech on Mother's Day, 1990. Anthologized among the best commencement speeches ever, it overflowed with the wisdom and of a truly engaged intellectual. One of those rare 3-eyed beasts, one eye on the present, another on the past, the third telescoped into the future. Your time, 1990, Brokaw told us in his unassuming Midwestern voice, is, quote, a time of explosive, dizzying, exhilarating, cataclysmic change. He reviewed the headlines of the previous year, beginning with the protest and bloody massacre at Tiananmen Square. Remember the Goddess of Democracy statue and and the Unknown Tank Man. Then came Poland's solidarity movement that ignited a pandemic of freedom that spread throughout Central and Eastern Europe, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, even Romania's Draculesque communist dictator Nicolae Ceausescu fell from power, the stake of democracy rammed through his chest by seas of torch-bearing Romanians craving freedom and democracy. I also like to use humor. I wrote one on the 7 deadly sins of the modern American university, and the sins are STEMism, bureaucratism, metricsism, assessmentism, grantism, credentialism, and footballism. And let me just mention the last one. Footballism, I will be brief, and lest I get in trouble with one of the university's most powerful constituencies, will just paraphrase American philosopher Rodney Dangerfield. I went to a football game the other night and a university sprung out. As a historian, I engage in lots of historical allusions, and I think about the importance of lead sentences that capture the attention of the reader. The British won their World War I battles, the aphorism goes, on the polo fields of Eton and Harrow, elite boarding schools for boys. As poetic as that may sound, those battles were actually won and some lost in the farmlands of Devon and factories of Manchester and Liverpool. But one thing is true. Throughout history, sports and games have served as preparation for war. Think of pankration, the bloody Greek martial art routinely practiced by Spartan boys, and the English medieval game Prisoner's Base, in which the team that captured the most prisoners won. And where were the U.S. military forces that bombarded and invaded Panama, Bosnia, Somalia, Afghanistan, and Iraq trained? I propose it happened to some extent in video game arcades at Chuck E. Cheese and suburban bedrooms where teenage boys played air combat and first-person shooter video games for endless hours. But where will America win or lose its battles in the future? Some believe looming wars. I fear if it happens in front of smartphones, swiping endless successions of TikTok videos. So I wanted to give you some examples of the columns, the fact that there's a much diversity of topics, and I'd love to engage the audience in questions and answers. I know Casper has some questions of his own.
Let's see if this works.
Hello, thank you for the reading. It was really nice to hear it, and thanks for being here today. So how long have you been writing this syndicated column for?
That's a very good question. You know, sometimes we come back to our first love. When I was a master's student at the University of Puerto Rico, I was 24, 25. I started writing columns. Why did I do that? Because my mentors were doing the same thing, and I started. But then when I went to Duke and started launching my career in this country, I had to set that aside. So you know, it's like sometimes you throw a message in a bottle, and so I threw a message in a bottle to Creator Syndicate, told them that I was interested, send them some samples, and in 2020, I started doing that. Now, I will confess that I'm not writing them anymore, and I'll tell you why. It is draining to produce something that you feel comfortable with, a good quality, every single week. And now remember, they're columnists for whom writing columns is their full-time job. I'm a university professor, so it became draining in that sense, and also almost emotionally draining because of harsh circumstances. You know, you have a war in Ukraine, you have authoritarianism rampant throughout the world, increase inequality, global warming, and I felt compelled to make all of these part of the collective of that book, and that too can be draining.
I wanted to ask about that myself. I know usually when you're reading, well, when I read history, it's so many bad things that happen in history. So how do you deal with all of those atrocities that happen throughout history and that keep continue to this day?
Yeah, well, it's easier if they're further into the past,
Yes.
and if they're things that you're daily, almost every day having to deal with. You know, talk about ChatGPT. ChatGPT is incapable as genius because passion is a prerequisite for genius. And machines don't have passion. I don't think we'll ever get them to have. And, you know, I wrote a history of the Cuban Revolution, which was also very personal to me because my family and I had to leave Cuba because of rising authoritarianism in Cuba. And I felt compelled, and I'll tell you why. This may take some of the people in the audience by surprise, but most of what's written in the academy about Cuba, the Cuban Revolution, is festive and celebratory. You know, there are many atrocities that have happened, and I felt compelled to write something that was, of course, there's always some bias, but something that was very balanced, that recognized some of the advantages of the revolution and successes, but also brought into light, you know, some of the atrocities. And Cuba now is at its lowest point ever. Actually, one of the columns, several columns, deal with the topic of Cuba today.
I know one of my colleagues from work, he went on a cruise a few years ago to Cuba. How is Cuba doing, by the way? Because I don't know too much about Cuba.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. Cuba is a beautiful country, a rich history, a history of accomplishment in so many areas. When you think of musical genres alone that came out of Cuba, we're talking about dozens and dozens and dozens. Architecture, ballet. So Cuba has had a very rich tradition, plastic arts, literary figures. But unfortunately, Cuba is at its lowest point ever. You know, and again, I don't want to come across as an anti-Castro fanatic, but you know, many people claim that Cuba's medical system is excellent. Well, it's not quite excellent. There's an effort to make it excellent, but it's not what it used to be during the first decades of the revolution. So it's very hard to find the most basic treatments and medicines. Similarly with food. The infrastructure is crumbling. And how is Cuba today? Well, I dedicated some columns to the San Isidro movement, which was a movement of artists and intellectuals that began in 2020. And for the first time, they opposed the government publicly, outdoors, and they were severely repressed. Then we come to 2021, and the unimaginable happened. You know, the subtitle of my book is The Unimaginable Events of 2019 to 2022. Well, what more unimaginable than Cuban masses rising up with various grievances, some political, some having to do with scarcity of foods. So I deal with Cuba as well, which is, it's controversial. It's very controversial.
And I do want to remind people in the audience, they're more than welcome to ask questions. Oh, and we actually just got a question. So, let's see. I don't know if it's a question, more like a comment. They said, I am a first generation American of Cuban parents. My father and his family were very well known, but because of political activism had to leave.
Okay, I assume they had to leave early in the revolution, or at least the first decade.
And this person writes, and if you want to, I can unmute you if you want to ask the question. I did give you hopefully that option of unmuting, but let me read what you wrote. The person also wrote, my cousin is a doctor and earns the equivalent of 40 American dollars. And they write 1961.
Yeah, that is very true. You know, this may sound very odd, but if you're a father and a mother and you have a son or a daughter, you would rather have them marry a hustler who sells Coca-Colas in the beach than marry a physician. I mean, I heard this from many people, and that has to do with the fact that as a physician, after all the training, you only make $48. And what do you do with $48 in Cuba? Well, you need a pair of shoes. That's $20. So there's very little left. Now, there's a related aspect to that, and that is that, and I will say this because I like to recognize what's true in the Cuban Revolution. The first thing is that Cuba, before the revolution, with all of the problems that it had, unequal access to medicine, all of that is true. At least Cuba had a very sound tradition of social medicine, of medicine as science. It wasn't a business. Of course, doctors got paid, and some of them got paid very well, but the mentality was, if you're a physician, you owe your services to the society. Now, when the revolution started, half of all doctors left. And that may sound a little bit contradictory with what I just had said, but half of them left. And there was a rush to train new doctors for several years. And this is absolutely true. The Cuban government made expanding medical services to the entire population, made it a priority. And even with the fact that so many physicians had left, was able to accomplish much of that. Now, whenever you're rationing, because you're now distributing in a different way, well, now all of a sudden you have hospitals and clinics in very remote places. Well, what happened was that beginning in 1993, Cuba entered its worst crisis, which was called El Periodo Especial, the special period. And the income for the island fizzled. That's when the Soviet Union, actually when it became Russia, backed out of supporting Cuba. And whoever wants to argue, and sometimes I have these conversations, that Cuba has an excellent medical system, I would say, well, it did for a while, but I would ask you, go to Cuba, get sick there, and go to one of the clinics and see what kind of service you're going to get. If you're a foreigner with dollars, it's going to be good. And again, I don't want to give the impression that, you know, I'm a rabid anti-Castro, but the book touches so many topics. It talks about Puerto Rico, another society that I know very well. It talks about Latinos in the United States. And what I try to do, Casper, is to, you know, be honest with the reader. There's so much nonsense out there, and sometimes you get in trouble. But I just wanted to be the way I am, and I write the way I sound. And I always want to be truthful, recognizing that sometimes you do have some biases that you need to check at the door.
And I did want to ask you, do you, as part of your research, do you get to, what do you do? Do you go to the library, of course, but do you also get to travel? Do you get to interview people? How does that work?
Yes. Today we had our last class, and one of the students in his presentation said that he was stimulated into choosing this topic because last year he went to Europe and he was in Czechoslovakia, and he decided to write his paper for the class on that. And I use that opportunity to tell my students, you know, if you can make it happen, please do. Travel abroad, work, study abroad, because it changes people, it changes their perspectives. So I'm very grateful to history, because I grew up in Puerto Rico, you know, very limited resources. And through the study of history, having become a university professor, that has opened the world to me. I mean, places that I never imagined I would go to, experiences, research, you know, and I owe all of that to history, because as a historian, you need to travel. You need to travel to where the sources are. And that's fascinating. Sometimes you spend, I'll just share something about one of my earlier books. You are at a library. Sometimes libraries have rare books and documents as well. And I remember back in 1990, was it 90? No, it was a little before that, probably 1987 or 8. I was at Duke University at the rare book and manuscripts collection, and I opened the box because I was interested in Cuba in the 19th century. I looked through the catalog, and the catalog said, remember, you know, we used to have catalogs that that were not digital. And I saw materials in the catalog and I requested them. Somebody brought them to my desk, and it was the greatest gift that I could get. It was a collection of documents written by a British family, and Duke University, which is a wealthy institution, was able to purchase that collection. Nobody had used it. And just briefly, let me tell you what it's about. In Britain, in Europe, was in the forefront of the struggle against the slave trade first and slavery then. But Spain had colonies that depended, or so they believed, depended on slaves to produce sugar, which was the lifeline of the economy. So the British government decides to establish what was called mixed courts for the suppression of the slave trade. So these courts were established in different parts of the world, in Africa, in Brazil, in Cuba, and they were supposed to have 2 judges, one Spanish judge and one English judge. And their role was to adjudicate in cases regarding slave trade vessels. So my protagonist, John Backhouse, goes to Havana to serve in this court. He kept a diary throughout his stay in Cuba. His wife kept a diary, and that's not very common that you have, you know, both sides of the story, two diaries that complement each other. So I started reading those diaries and dozens of letters that they wrote back and forth over the Atlantic, and I just fell in love with the family. And I said to myself, this is a story worth telling. It ends up tragically because in the end, Backhouse, well, you know, almost everything that could go wrong went wrong for them. You know, they're in Cuba, they don't like the heat, the humidity. They're not making as much money as they thought they would. Havana is one of the most expensive places on the earth. they were Protestants, and all of a sudden they have a baby. So who's going to christen that baby? It was illegal to do that. They got into debt. So everything that could go wrong went wrong. Now, Grace, John's wife, is going to have another baby, and she decides, let me go and have that baby in England, because I mean, there were also issues with diseases. And one day, and again, I had fallen in love with these materials and with this family. I'm reading in the diary, her diary, and a page is torn. That's uncommon, that's rare. But then I open a little envelope that had some notices of his death. John Backhouse, 837, had been killed in Havana, and it becomes a mystery. And that's how you get, enamored with your characters. And so that became my second book, Fighting Slavery in the Caribbean.
Very nice. And I do want to remind everybody you're welcome to ask questions in the chat, and I can also unmute you. So if anybody wants to speak directly, you can put it in the chat and I'll unmute you. Let's see if we have any questions I can ask you. So you have written 7 history books, yet When the World Turned Upside Down is very different. And it's a collection of published opinion columns. Can you share your motivation for doing something different?
Yes. Well, some of them had to do with the fact that, I got tired of writing that many history books. And for those of you who know the discipline of history, writing a history book takes on average 10 years. So I wanted a break from that. When you're writing a book, you invest time and energy and resources, and the book comes out 8, 9, 10, 11 years later. But when you write a column, you have access to a broader population, and the reactions are immediate. So you spend a week doing research on a column, it gets published, and then it reaches the public, and you get the reactions and have an impact right away. So that's one of the main motivations. I wanted to explore the genre, but as I said, unfortunately, I've run out of energy because it's so time consuming. And when you have to teach and you have other responsibilities, it's hard to keep it up, because what they do is that they hire you, they offer you a contract, but you have to turn one every week, 750 words. But to get to those 750 words, we're talking about 15, 20 hours of research.
Thank you. And it is said that all art is autobiographical. Does that apply to essays? And does that apply to a collection of columns?
Yes, I believe so. Again, connecting with what I said earlier, having rich life experiences and how that becomes raw material, if not for direct use in what you write, at least it stimulates you, right? It's interesting that we don't think of essays as being really within the realm of literature. We think of novels and poetry, but essays are sort of out of that field. When it comes to history, it's not literature at all. And and I know that there's some historians that write beautifully, better than novelists, but for some reason we don't include. There are courses in literature, but they never include the genre of history. But I believe that, and I pay a lot of attention to the prose, that if you attempt to write beautifully, then it's art. And I believe that most art, if it comes out of the heart and out of your lived experiences, is autobiographical. There's one column that I write. I don't know if I can find it easily here. one of the columns was inspired by my atlas. I was a student in Peru growing up, and it must have been 4th grade, and I went to an English school run by English lay preachers, and we had to buy an atlas. I still have that atlas. I don't think I have it here. I have it at home. And I was 9 years old, and to fall in love with a book, an atlas. I still have it, and I'm 63. And how that book opened so many doors for me, curiosity. So I wrote a column inspired on my relationship with that atlas. And I also wrote, talk about libraries. I have 2 libraries now. I have one at home and the one behind me in my office. But I used to have for many, many years a library in Puerto Rico. And it was in my parents' home, and they were sort of trying to clean it up and make space for other things. And then I said, well, let me look at my collection, let me weed it out. And when I started doing that, I opened the closet where the books were, pulling one title after another, and they brought beautiful memories. I'll share just one of them. When I was 18, about to enter the University of Puerto Rico, and this is privilege. Sometimes we don't acknowledge privilege. So we weren't rich, but we lived in an area that some well-to-do people and professionals lived. My father himself was a professional, and my father had the idea to invite a neighbor to my house so that we could have dinner, and the neighbor was a dean at one of the local universities. You see, that's privilege. Not everybody gets to do that. I must acknowledge it. We believe that we're self-made. No. We have privileges. And that day was transformative. He was very interested in what I planned to do. And he said, well, what are you going to be studying? And I told him, well, I think I want to be a teacher and teach history. And then he paused for a minute and he said, well, Luis, tell me, where is your passion? Is it in the teaching or is it in history? And I said, in history. And he said, well, if that's the case, then you should go to the humanities, the College of Humanities, not the School of Education. He transformed my life right there in one conversation. And then before he was going to leave, before leaving, he pulled out a book that he had written entitled The Ideas of the Renaissance. He pulled it out with a pen. He dedicated it to me. For Luis Martinez, with the hope that this book will foment your vocation for history. It was one of those books that I never get rid of. Now, talk about digital books. Could that happen with a digital book? I don't think so.
Okay, great. We have another question, and they ask, what is the best advice you can give about researching history and organizing your materials? And they go on to say, I am my family archivist, and at times I am overwhelmed by the volume.
Yes. That's a lovely role to play. And I took on that responsibility very early on. So if this is a book about your family, then, and I get those questions often, well, let's see, you need to be very organized. So you need to have your documents organized according to the topics. One of the things that I like to do early on is to create an outline. Outlines are there to help you, not to imprison you. So if there are 5 topics, then I organize my materials in those 5 topics. it's always important if you're writing a family history to enrich that history with materials beyond the family archive. For example, let's say that you have an uncle who was an opera singer in New York. Well, you have the family documents, but you can enrich that narrative by looking at newspapers, by looking at one of the things that I miss from the Northeast is, you have all these wonderful specialized libraries, the opera library, in the Northeast and the New York metropolitan area. So, and let me give you an example of what I did with that. When I found those documents of the Backhouse family, I embraced that family, and I said to myself, Luis, this is going to be your next book. And well, the documents have limitations. For example, one of the things that the family liked to do often was that they would go in a carriage to downtown Havana to have ice cream. And okay, that appears. But then I started looking and finding other books about Havana at that period that described the ice cream parlor. And there was a fountain in the middle. And these were the flavors. You see how even if you have very limited material from the family documents, you can enrich that picture with outside sources. And oral history is very important, interviewing people. But that's wonderful. A lot of people want to write family histories, and then you have to organize it, and there has to be a story. There has to be a compelling story. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's a nice question. I know sometimes I go with my mother on vacation, so I'll take her maybe on a cruise once a year. So I try to take a lot of photos, and then I make a photo book. So that way we can always go back and look at the photos after it's done. So it is special to try to retain all the information that you can.
Yeah, and that has changed, as you know. I work with old postcards. People, I mean, before we click and send a picture, I'm in the Bahamas, look at this straw hat. People would buy postcards and write. And those became sources, just letters also. Many people are fortunate to have these collections at home.
So yeah, I just want to remind everybody we're going to be closing up soon, ending soon. So make sure to type in any last minute questions that you have. And so speaking about technology, what threats and challenges does ChatGPT present for essayists and opinion columnists? And I know you also talked about cell phones. Like, what do you think cell phones are doing to the next generation? Because now I see everybody on their phones all the time, and it seems to be like a brain drain where people are not really as productive, in my opinion, like they could be, and including myself.
Yes. Well, I mean, technological change has happened across history. What we are seeing, however, is that technological change happens so fast. I grew up at home, and we had one of those rotary phones. It was black because if you wanted white, it was more expensive. I don't know why. And we had that phone, you were sort of strung to it. There was no privacy. Now, how did we get from that to people having to change their phones every year? In part is, the fast pace of change. Now, there are many things that are helpful, and I embrace, even Grammarly, Grammarly that you use. I don't use it, actually. I use spell check, but Grammarly helps people learn grammar. What's happening with ChatGPT is that you outsource important skills that have been part of our civilization. Things like note-taking, summarizing, creating an outline. And then what we see today is that And I see some of my students do it. Their papers are generated by ChatGPT. Now, that is very dangerous because the skills that come with researching, thinking, rethinking, essay means to always be testing. If we lose those skills, I don't know what's going to happen. Sometimes I feel like one of those Irish monks in the Middle Ages, and maybe generations, centuries from now, if we're still around, we'll discover the art of essay that some people say is dead.
And we are winding down, so thank you so much. It's been great talking with you and telling us so many things. So before you go, are you working on a new book? It seems to like you're very busy. So what kind of things are you working on, especially now that you have so much free time since you're not doing your column anymore? So what are you working on now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I love to tell stories. One of my fields of research has been slavery in the Caribbean, and I am doing something that is a collection of 50 short stories, but 50 short stories in quotations because they're nonfiction. What I do is I use the techniques of the storyteller and the novelist to create a narrative all based on documentation. We have 1 minute, but I'll share it very briefly. These slaves, one of them was in Cuba, and he was rowing a boat away from the coast. An English engineer says, "What are you doing? Where are you going?" The slave says, "I'm rowing to Africa." Now, that is some story. But behind that story, there are notions of distance, notions of the oceans as connectors. It's fascinating. And that will be one of the 50 stories.
That's really, we're looking forward to it. Hopefully we can have you back when you finish your stories. And how can people learn more about you or get in touch with you if they enjoyed hearing you today?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much to the audience. We're all busy, but you made the time to share with us. It means a lot to me. If you're interested, I have a webpage. It's Cultural Trends. The word cultural and then TRANS. And I have my books there. I have my speaking engagements. I see a very good friend that just joined us. That's where you can find more information.
And are you ever going to be in the New York area?
I plan to, yes, and I'll let you know.
Okay, sounds good. So thank you again for joining us. Looking forward to your future works and keep up the good work, and congratulations on the last day of your semester for this year.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening, all.
Bye-bye. Thank you everyone for joining us. Take care.